Now I'm going to get into the topic of my recent paper, just accepted in Recency at Fides, centered on Magisterium AI, and I'm given the time frame of 1 month to revise it. So this will be a great occasion to get feedback and criticisms, right? Constructive advices, and etc. Now, there's one problem, right? So I think to train the AI to be able to answer your questions on the Catholic faith, Longbeard and the team working on Magisterium AI has to feed or has to input more and more documents, right, just to inform the AI. So it seems that it's all about accumulation, but my argument is that it's not, right? So it's not enough just to accumulate documents. There are 3 challenges. The first one is document filtering. Now, I spoke at length with Matthew, with Patrick, with the Longbeard team about this. Now, how can you make the AI filter out some documents? Because you don't always want to consult the entire database. Right? So let's say I just want to study the notion of love in Familiaris Consortio. Perhaps not in Amoris Laetitia or not in other works. Right? So for some questions, the AI will do the work, will respond to your question, but in others, no. The example known also to the team of Longbeard is that I tried asking the question, can you explain the nature of blessings without citing fiducia supplicans? Right? So it has difficulties. Now, I think this is an area, but I think this is very doable in the future. Another challenge is we cannot only focus on Magisterium, because Magisterium is there not to clarify all sorts of theological, philosophical questions, or historical questions as well. Now, and we know there are so many questions the Magisterium does not have any duty to address, right? Exegetical questions, right? A simple question as, what does fire mean when Jesus talks about baptism with fire and the Spirit? That's some biblical texts have been treated by the Magisterium, but not all. And there was one, so to write this paper, I read the user feedback of Magisterium AI, around almost 400 feedback, I think, right? 350 entries. One of the users said, you should just focus on the formal papal pronouncements and not on the informal statements like in-flight interviews or statements by third-party organizations. I beg to disagree because of the former thing I said, right? Magisterium itself is not enough, and then the Magisterium, what is Magisterium and not? This is another question, of course, which will take us very beyond the topic. Depends on the substance, on the content of what the Pope is saying, right? So matters of faith and morals. He could, I consulted Professor Mikko of Santa Croce about this. The Pope could make an ex cathedra statement in an in-flight interview as well. Now, whether that's convenient or not, that's another question, but as long as he has the intention, it's about faith and morals, he could do it. So it's not convenient to exclude his more informal declarations or statements. Now, the third problem I observe in the database is this hierarchy of sources. So it's not enough to accumulate documents for the AI to process or for the AI to digest. You have to distinguish between the documents because not all sources are equal. Not all of them are the same. Now, how can you distinguish the sources? I'll just lay out the priority I propose in the paper. So I think first, we have to have the priority of recency, right? So train the AI to prefer more recent documents in certain cases. In other cases, the AI have to prefer more authoritative documents. So that's the priority of authority. And lastly, the priority of form. I'll give some examples about these 3 priorities. So recency, for example. So if you have Baltimore Catechism, and the Catechism of the Catholic Church, which is more recent, 1992, and the other one is 1885. So the AI has to prioritize or preferred the earlier, the more recent document, in this case, the Catechism of the Catholic Church. Same thing as, I think, arguably, the Catechism of the Council of Trent, which is still very authoritative, very well read. One thing I'll try to express here, I don't know if I can say this well enough, there's a lot of nuance in this. We can argue about which has to be preferred, which is more authoritative, but we'll see what arguments will come up later, right, from the panelists as well. Or, for example, I put this example, the question of infants who die without baptism. Now, there's the famous theory of limbo in the Middle Ages. The scholars of Thomas will know very well. But then the church has kind of proposed an updated vision of how we can conceive the fate of the infants who die without baptism in the recent document. So I think if you ask now we can't do the trial here, right? Display for everybody. It'd be good if you could, but now if you ask the Magisterium AI, it'd be interesting to see how it answers, which document it quotes, right? This does not say that the theory of limbo loses its values. It's very valuable, very important, for example, for the consideration of nature and grace, and for so many other topics in theology. But I'm just saying, I think the machine should prefer the more recent document in this case. Or Lumen Gentium, we know that Vatican II has proposed an ecclesiology that's a bit different, right? Richer, enriches the previous ecclesiologies, for example, that we find in Pius XII. I think in this case as well, the more recent document should be preferred. Or Code of Canon Law, right? I don't spot any canon lawyer in this room, but yeah, I think the newer canon law has to be preferred or prioritized over the previous canon law. This does not say, again, that the previous canon law loses its values. There's a very beautiful canon encouraging the study of Thomas Aquinas, which does not appear in the newer Code of Canon Law, for example. So it's valuable, but has to be, the AI, I think, has to prefer the more recent document in this case. So on to the second, let me back up a little bit. So on to the second criterion of priority. The priority of recency is not enough, because newer does not always mean better, right? I think that's a vice many academics would tend to have. We think, okay, newer sources are better. I think in some sense, yes, they're better because they're more complete, they're more comprehensive, they cover more literature, more recent literature. But in theology, newer does not always mean better. So we have to enrich the first priority with a second priority, which I term priority of authority. This could have other names we could discuss later, right? So there are certain authors that are almost unanimously considered as more authoritative than the others because of his works, because of the breadth of his works, because of the truth of his works, because of the perenniality of his works. So many reasons we can debate and argue. I give an example of St. Augustine, right? So I think this is not debatable. Nobody's going to insult me later, right? So I think St. Augustine has to be prioritized over Isidore of Seville or some later fathers. Of course, I don't say that the study of Isidore of Seville is not worth it, right? But in answering a question, again, so I think we have to place ourselves within the domain of religious education, right? Instructions, and not so much on the erudition of a specific author, but this is more on the field of, how can we educate people, right? So the mission of Magisterium AI, Matthew will express better, is to reach out to as many people as possible, right? Those who don't have access to education or to articles, works, the volumes we have here in Rome, for example, right? Just to help them gain access to the truth. So in this case, I think Augustine is more authoritative than Isidore. Peter Lombard, I think, has to be prioritized over Robert Grosseteste, right? For so many reasons. Aquinas, I'm not trying not to be biased, but the thing is, is more important in certain senses. in education than William of Ockham. And then the third criteria, form. So back a little bit. What do I mean by form? Now, we have content, we have form. So the content is the thing you try to express, the truth you try to deliver. The form is what the medievals would call the modus significandi, right? The way you express things, the way you say things. Now, I put a question mark here because I think this is quite debatable. Right? So the priority of form. Okay, first we have the priority of recency. The AI, we should train the AI to prioritize more recent documents. And the second, we have priority of authority. The AI should prioritize more authoritative sources and authors. And then the form. So it's not enough, I argue, for us to prioritize always the most authoritative sources or authors. Because those authors may have way of saying things that are no longer applicable or no longer convenient, at least for today's society. Right? I think that's the goal of Vatican II, the goal of the modern popes as well. Now, I give this example, for example. In 1 Corinthians, we see Paul talking about women. So, women should be silent in the churches, for they are not permitted to speak, but should be subordinate, as the law also says. This is the Bible. But we know that the church nowadays teaches, or her practices tell us that women have a very important place in the church, and that's not debatable. And I myself am very convinced about that. So, for example, I just quoted the Synod of Bishops, right, on synodality. There's no reason or impediment that should prevent women from carrying out leadership roles in the church. What comes from the Holy Spirit cannot be stopped. Now, I put a question mark because how can we solve this tension? Well, first of all, I think the interpretation of 1 Corinthians 14:34 has to be clarified. Many exegetes will say that, well, here Paul is actually talking about not allowing women to preach in the church, so it's more specific than letting them speak, right? So it's not letting them preach the homilies in the churches and masses. Now, if that's the interpretation, we won't have any problem. But then there are more passages in the Bible whose languages maybe could be clarified further, right? Now, here we have the question of the inerrancy of the Bible entering in, right? So the scripture scholars will have their say as well. The next one is probably clearer. So one user back in 2023 tried out Magisterium AI, and he or she, I don't know who this person was, this user asked the AI, why could women not be ordained priests in the Catholic Church? And that earlier, now it's corrected, but that earlier AI said women cannot be priests because they are in a state of subjection. Now, this AI quotes Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas, who said this, right, indeed, in his supplement to the Summa Theologiae. So I, as a Thomas scholar, would have my argument. I would say, well, Thomas didn't really write that supplement to begin with, right? And then we could have some arguments about that. But then this feedback, I think, is important, right? Because this is applicable to so many other cases where you can have an authoritative, important author in the past whose language is no longer convenient, but the truth he tries to convey still is convenient. Right? Now, perhaps in answering the question of this person, why women can't be ordained priests is probably more useful to quote the Catechism, right? Who talks about Jesus being celibate, being male, right? And so I think the answer of the Catechism is more theological, more personal, more anthropological as well. Now, here we have this priority of form, right? I think AI nowadays, knowing the people who use AI have to adopt its language to a language that's compatible or suitable to the people's understanding, general public.